Hi, I'm Andrew Cutler. I am currently an economic development specialist with the U.S. Department of Commerce Economic Development Administration. But in 2019 and into um, early to mid 2020, I was with the Federal Emergency Management Agency, with FEMA, with the Department of Homeland Security, and in a very different role than I'm in now. And my primary focus was to respond to major disasters and work from the federal side to assist states in developing and planning their longer term recovery and how to think about that and kind of be able to assess their needs and put together a plan and a strategy to um, recover as a state and as local community. And so in that role, I deployed to Missouri in September 2019 as a coordinator for the community planning and capacity building recovery support function on the federal side, which Missouri was so lovely as to just call community. And that was a lot simpler than the federal name for it. But we had the two kind of corresponding elements there of the federal side and the state side. And so I was the federal side, which it sounds like it has not been something that is necessarily you've been hearing from throughout the Resiliency Summit. So hopefully I can bring a little insight into that. And so arriving in Missouri in September, that's obviously a little after there had been kind of the major flooding incidents. There were still areas where I was able to go out with and meet with community members and still see areas that were flooded and see areas where they were still having issues and needing more immediate support. But at the same time, most of what we were responding to was two separate disaster declarations. One that was for kind of a shorter period of a lot of intense flooding and rain and tornadoes, as well as that was earlier in the year in 2019, and then another one where it was just a longer term period because basically after they did that first declaration, it kind of stopped raining briefly, and we were like, oh, everything's good, and then apparently it just kind of started continuing to just rain and flood and storm throughout most of the summer, and so an additional declaration was made, and that kind of was where we started seeing that there was going to be some serious need to really think strategically about how the state was going to recover from that flooding. And so they started bringing in additional support on the federal side, and that's when I showed up. So we had a immediate response operation from FEMA on the ground for quite a while already by the time I got there, and we had like one or two people on the recovery end of things there to kind of monitor and see where things were going, and that's where they were able to recognize that yeah, there was going to be a need to think about this on a broader level since in the end the flooding that occurred was on the level of like not seen since the Great Big Floods of 1993. So there was a lot of impact and a lot to consider. And so basically then um, fortunately for us from the federal side, looking at it that way, but also fortunately for Missouri, I would like to think Missouri had begun adopting their own version of the kind of general federal idea for how to develop a recovery. How do you recover from a disaster? And what does that look like? And how do you kind of organize that and make that actually something that can be moved on and executed into useful projects and things. Um, and so they already had that generally set up, and we were able to come in, and they had made it to where it would match and complement the normal kind of ongoing federal strategy. So that was a really cool experience coming in from the federal side because it is common that that the federal agency, that FEMA and our partners, the other federal agencies that FEMA could bring in, um, would show up and kind of just do their own assessment, not really have a whole lot of input from the state, and just try to kind of be like, hey, here's some things that we think have gone wrong and that we figure you could fix, and here's some ideas about how you might do it, and then just kind of like provide a menu of options and that they might want to address and send it off and then take off. But fortunately for us, and I hope fortunately for Missouri, in this case, we were able to for one of the first times I've really seen it work well was to be able to come in and have that complementary, how the system was designed originally to work, that the state would have their own um, general recovery framework that they're working from for how we're going to make things happen, and that would complement the federal side so that we can work together to help the state be able to leverage federal resources, and also have the federal side be able to better understand and address those resources more directly to the state's actual needs instead of just trying to kind of guess, which can often be the case. Um, and so that was a really unique, awesome, interesting experience. And through that, we came kind of started out with trying to put together what we call a mission scoping assessment, and that is usually, and in this case, was more trying to get on a more broader level, and looking mainly at like specific partners and like input as much as we could, and in this case, a lot from the state. And kind of look on that broader level, kind of see like what is the recovery mission, and what were the full impacts of the disaster and that it was experienced, and what is going to kind of need to be kind of the scope of the recovery and how much needs to be involved in that. What are the main issues to look at? And so started through that, identifying those kind of main issues. Had already kind of initially done some advanced assessment that had identified there was enough of a concern that we were going to need to bring in a variety of federal partners. So a lot of them had already showed up, and then we were able to bring in some more because FEMA has that ability. And in the federal government, they can mission assign other federal agencies, and basically just tell them, hey, you have to show up and be part of this, and provide information and access into your resources and services to assist the state. So in that case, we were able to get that happening, and then be able to look at that and see, okay, here's where we're at with this. And so through that process, we had some level of like mostly coordination at the state level, and then with the state, having the state offer us introductions and access to specific partners that they were working with that they knew would have really good kind of get that first upfront information, and then put together kind of the scope of what we would need to look at into further, and how we could develop strategies to address that. And so that led into putting together the recovery support strategy, which is the RSS. If I start using that term there, you'll hopefully know what I'm talking about then. So to build that out, that is was intended to be a kind of more full detailed document. We put together kind of a matrix to go along with that. That was basically a giant Excel workbook that has all kinds of different things in there to connect and address different issues and goals. And so pretty much the point is to come up with what are the main goals that we want to accomplish, that if we meet that goal, Missouri would hopefully have had some significant level of recovery from the disaster that they had experienced, and then looking at those goals, how would we address those goals? And so then we break it down and turn those into SMART goals and make them specific and measurable and attainable and time bound and forgetting what the R is, but I'm sure that a lot of people out there know exactly what it is, and if you were going to be giving me feedback, I'd hear about it. Um, but anyway, so basically, as we do that, then we start building out objectives and that can meet those goals and looking into more details and breaking those down into tasks and actions and figuring out the time frames for when those would be. And we develop shorter term goals and kind of midterm and longer term goals, and in that process started really engaging the community more and started holding these whole community recovery meetings where we were able to bring in a variety of different partners and just community members and people from across the state, even though we were generally primarily holding them in Jefferson City. We were, even before COVID times, able to do some more also virtual opportunities and different things to kind of just get the word out and connect across the state across the board and bringing people together throughout the state to kind of think, hey, what are we looking at? What's going to make this better, and what are your needs in your community? Because it's not necessarily a one size fits all solution at any given point. But there are commonalities as well, certain things that we see like, okay, this community has this problem, and also these other communities have the same problem. So what can we do to address that, and how can we then take those resources that exist at the federal level or that the state already has, but that those local communities or counties may not know about, or have the resources to access, or in the first place, because resources can be available, but oftentimes you find that smaller communities where the most of the governing is maybe on a volunteer basis or is pretty limited in its scope, and can often also have one of the things we found was that in Missouri there was a lot of communities where they were pretty much run more or less by elected officials, maybe like one or two professional kind of administrators who kind of keep things going, but a lot of it was done by their elected officials, who then had term limits or just local politics that would lead them to not necessarily be in those positions in that community for particularly long, and that would kind of then lead to not being able to necessarily retain this institutional knowledge of, what's happened before. What did we do as a community back in 1993 when we had these crazy floods before? How did we recover from that? And what was the strategies that we came up with? Or, what did that look like? And then what could we take on now? Or just even having the knowledge to say, oh, you know what, there's probably these federal grants or these other programs through different nonprofits or regional planning organizations or different things, and we could apply to those. And here's how we do it. Often they're not necessarily going to even know that to begin with, or have the time or resources to be able to do that. And another thing that kind of plays into too, that we also found, that was something that I found particularly interesting in this case, that I don't think I had at least thought about before, and I don't think we would have if it hadn't been for, in this case, that really good partnership that we had with the state, because it actually came out of the component where the state, although we had kind of our standard like 6 recovery areas that there are different recovery support functions that the federal system and framework uses, the state also wanted to include agriculture, which is not something that we necessarily, as the federal government, had particularly made like a unique specific focus in the past, or that it was part of our standard kind of framework. But in this case, we incorporated that and we took a special look at agriculture and we brought people in on the federal side from USDA and started looking at that. And as we were doing that, one of the things that came out of that and the focus on and the partnership with the state agencies, and that was noticing that there had been a lot of concerns about the farmers whose crops have been damaged and in general livelihoods just lives wrecked in a way from like not being able to um, have any kind of chance to harvest their crops, anything just destroyed by the floods, various things that happened through the experiencing a disaster, and that had led to a lot of concerns with farmers' mental health. There had been reports of definitely uptick in farmer suicides and other concerns, and so they had started focusing on that and talking about, hey, let's focus on that and make that part of the agricultural concern there, and so and then broaden that and consider that in terms of all of the other ways that impacts different other sectors and things and just even just the health and the and wellness and like social services and all of that. So started looking at that, but then us as being on the community side of things started looking at that and thinking, well, you know what, as we're thinking about like local government and these we're looking at these that are like very small towns that don't necessarily have a lot of capacity is because Missouri, like just about most of the country, of course, you have some of those bigger communities and bigger cities that were impacted, but they also have um, some general capacity to kind of think through the recovery, and they know where to go and how to get the resources they need to recover. But that's a smaller proportion, and a much larger proportion are these rural areas or smaller communities, and where those resources are lacking, we had first just been thinking about, and one of the things we would usually kind of come in, assume, and then just kind of get the data to verify, was that anytime we would come into a disaster, we'd figure, well, probably there are these small communities that we need to pay attention to, and that probably don't have that experience and the resources. In this case, we also discovered that something that we hadn't necessarily thought about before, and that only came out of having that like connected structure of communicating with the different groups and thinking about all the different aspects of everything together as a coordinated kind of interagency and intersector group of recovery focused on that and having those discussions. We started thinking about mental health and how does that impact not only the farmers that it was kind of getting in the media and stuff. There was that was getting pointed out, and so that was started where that sort of started coming from. Some from the media, some from partners at the state level and local levels that were saying, "Hey, this is a concern." But we also started noticing that, well, what about like the local government officials that are, often, especially if they're volunteers, not only maybe their mental health, but then also the concerns as far as just their ability to do anything related to the government, especially if it's not their regular day-to-day job, or even if it is, they're going to have impacts to their own lives potentially from this disaster. They may not have a home anymore. They may have any other variety of concerns going on. And that's going to likely impact their mental health and as well as their regular physical health and their ability to, focus on rallying their community to think about how they're going to recover and to apply to get resources and do the research that they need and all of that kind of stuff that is necessary to kind of come back to a state of kind of functioning and somewhat normality, although there's always going to be like a more of a new normal after disaster, which I guess is a catchphrase that a lot of people would probably prefer I didn't use, but I don't know. I think it really describes a lot of the times what you're going to have to face when you come out of disasters, that new normal. And but it can be a bit of a cliche. But yeah. So thinking about that kind of just led us into that whole thing, and I kind of just ran off on a tangent there. But at the same time, that that is a lot of what we were able to do. They were useful tangents, but like in our being able to have that connection that we had with the state and work on that and develop all of these kind of strategies together and think through and talk through this and meet with members of the community and have the access that as the federal government we often don't get when we come into communities because and it's totally understandable although the federal government has all kinds of great resources and you know people do tend to want to take advantage of that and access those resources there's also this kind of element of it where it's like well but we know what's best for our community. We don't necessarily need you to tell us what's wrong with us. And we can figure that out. Like, just, you know, give us money. But otherwise, we don't necessarily want to partner with you. So that's often the case. And in this case, it wasn't. And that was so amazing and kind of refreshing and really cool because as the you know with FEMA strategy and you know I say this as and everything I'm saying I you know say as speaking from my previous role with FEMA and speaking from not currently representing FEMA or necessarily inherently representing all of everything about FEMA during that time either just to kind of get that out of the way um, cover myself but generally, you know, FEMA, they have a full kind of framework and other guidance for how to interact with communities and how to help communities develop and think about and process and plan for their recovery from disasters. And it's not what some people tend to come and assume that we just want to come in and tell you exactly what you got to do. Here's this. It tends to end up being that but almost ironically enough, it can tend to be that. And of course, then the communities are free to say yes or no or whatever. But like, ideally, it's not that. It's ideally it's not that the federal side, FEMA or any of the other agencies come in and just say, "Hey, here's what you got to do. Oh, here's the problems you have. Like, you just do this and you'll fix it and it'll be great, whatever." That's because that's not actually that helpful. And the federal government recognizes that that's not in the whole plan and the strategy is to come in and work in coordination with the state and have that local led and whole community ground up approach to thinking about long-term recovery. And unfortunately, that just doesn't necessarily happen so often. But in this case, what was amazing was working with Missouri and them wanting to join that and having already done the work on their side, somewhat in response to some of the previous disasters, and thinking about that. And beginning to take those steps to say, hey, here's how we, as the state of Missouri, and can start thinking about how do we structure this so that we know what to do and what to say and how to connect and how to make the most of bringing in federal partners and working together and taking advantage of the resources they can provide, but not but also being able to say hey, this is our state, this is our home. We know what's best and we know what's good, but we also know that you have, as the federal government, lots of resources and expertise, and that there are people out there that are hired that, or that the federal government can even just with disaster funds can bring in contractors and stuff. And we did that some. My current organization actually brought in some with the Economic Development Administration and Department of Commerce brought in some really brilliant contractors who were experts in their fields of economic development and how to do that in recovery from disaster. And they wouldn't have necessarily needed to or been inclined to do that if there wasn't that input and buy-in from the state. And then the state was able to access those resources for people who were not telling them, here's what you have to do. They were saying, hey, we want to help and we know how to do this. We've done this kind of thing other places. We know the Missouri is similar, but not the same to everywhere else. I had just come from Nebraska. In my role with FEMA, I had just come from Nebraska before I went to Missouri, and even in that role, I mean, I I was able to take some of the experience I learned in Nebraska and in other states before that and apply it in Missouri and say, hey, here's something I learned before, but it's not like, oh, well, we did this. You just have to do this because this is the only thing that ever works or whatever. But just saying, being able to offer that and then have the state listen and say, hey, um, here's that sounds great. We would love to know about that. Or, well, that sounds interesting, but that's probably not going to work in Missouri. But maybe if we tweaked it and did this, and then maybe that would work. And then being able to say, okay, cool, like, yeah, let's figure out how to do that. And being in the same room and talking and communicating allowed us to be able to put together something that I believe and I hope is really helping guide the state in their recovery. Uh, and sounds like, from what I understand, we're recording this before the Resiliency Summit, but that in most of what you're going to hear in the summit is a lot of the state partners being able to talk about how some of those things that we all came up with are being actually executed and are being done in right now and have been done and will be done to support the state and in their recovery, support the local communities and the regions and think about it on a full, broad level of the entire community that are going to, in the long run, hopefully make the state more resilient to the next disaster, better able to recover from the next one, as well as just speed along and improve and make a better recovery currently from the ongoing impacts of the 2019 floods. Um, I mean, I know right now I'm kind of been out of the disaster world directly a little bit for the last a little over a year since I transitioned to my job positions. But at the same time, we in the Economic Development Administration have been having we were able to be presented with projects to consider funding that came out of the process that we were doing with the whole group in Missouri in 2019 and into 2020, and then through that we're able to take things that probably wouldn't have necessarily been thought up or that wouldn't have had the communities that needed them knowing that there was assistance available because one of the primary things that we were doing from when I was on the FEMA side was also trying to think about, okay, a big portion of it is, hey, okay, so FEMA funds certain things when a disaster happens, and there are an element to which FEMA comes in and they do what has traditionally been called recovery, but it doesn't last that long and it only covers specific certain things that are kind of tend to be more immediate needs. And then outside of that, that's what FEMA can do with their money. But having this coordinating structure, then bringing that in and being able to assign other agencies to consider the concerns of this disaster and of the state in this instance is able to then also make those connections and find other sources of potential funding that maybe didn't necessarily have anything to do with disaster and maybe did, but in fact in this case like we're thinking from the side with the Economic Development Administration, with EDA, we the EDA did get a supplemental funding portion for the 2019 disasters and was able to fund some of the projects that were developed through that, but also I am now a project officer with EDA for a project that is very much related to the 2019 flooding, but did not end up being able to kind of just have the right timing and the everything else to be able to fit into that the funding that EDA had for the 2019 disaster specifically, but then was able to take that project and then knew of what EDA could do and how they could make that fit just our normal programs. And they were able to then apply, that community was, and they were able to end up successfully getting an award from EDA to fund a project that is related to recovering from the 2019 disasters, but was actually just funded out of EDA's normal pot of money that they do their normal day-to-day funding of economic development related projects in the United States throughout the year, just normally. And that community wouldn't necessarily have known, they may have, but their first time grant recipient from EDA. So I suspect that was their first time thinking about it, and knowing that this existed and being able to consider, hey, let's get let's look at this option to be able to fund this need that we have. And they were able to get it, even though it didn't come directly from that specific 2019 disaster money. They were able to then know the process, know what the my now agency does, and recognize that their need would fit into our regular programs, and then apply and successfully get the award. So that was hopefully one of the success stories I know of, and I know that there are many more, and I'm hoping that you're hearing lots of great success stories throughout the symposium, and that you will be hearing more in the future at future symposiums. And in fact, this symposium itself was an idea that we collectively came up with as the interagency recovery coordination group from the state and the feds and all the different community partners and everything. We're like, hey, as we're doing these kind of whole community recovery meetings, like maybe it's a good idea to do this all the time, at least like check in once a year and see how things are going, and think about not only recovery from the 2019 floods, but what can we do to think about how we will recover from the next one, and what can we do to make the communities and the state more resilient. And so we're like, let's put in there to have a goal to do a annual symposium focused on resiliency. And unfortunately, we weren't not able to do it in person, and we weren't able to do it last year with COVID. But I'm really excited and glad that we're getting to do it now, and that I got to be able to come back and participate and say something, and just kind of give some insight into how that all came about. So hopefully that was useful. And I guess I would also just follow up and say I was going to go through and just like walk you through the recovery support strategies that we came up with, but I don't know. I think you could read through that on your own and look at those specific strategies. But I guess also the way that it worked out when we were with the state, we ended up having, although the state was still separating community and all of the things that fall under that, as well as like economic specifically, for as separate support strategies, but ended up having one person coordinating both of those on the side of the state. And then the one thing that we get with the other federal agencies is that often, sometimes FEMA can get them to actually come and stay and like be continually there throughout the period of recovery. But sometimes it just doesn't work out, or we can only bring them in sometimes here and there for little bits. And so actually with EDA that I work for now, that was what they were doing. They had their support was kind of able to only come in and out, be in for a week or two, then be out, and then have to support remotely and then come back. And so with that, as well as the community and economic functions being jointly coordinated on the state side, myself as the community coordinator for the federal side, and being there consistently and staying in Jefferson City the entire time, that I was there from September through March. Yeah, actually I ended up getting a plane out and headed back to where I was living then, in North Carolina, and literally like a couple days after I got home, or maybe the next day, I think, was when they made the initial emergency declaration for COVID, and everything started shutting down. So that was pretty wild. And that I mean has been just a whole other additional element to this that it's um, we definitely didn't foresee in September through even more or less into February and March of 2019, that was exactly what that would all entail. And so we didn't necessarily consider that in the resiliency. But fortunately, I do think that a lot of the things that we were thinking of with the resiliency, and communities and elements that we put in there for and talked about for how to support broader health initiatives, and we talked about telemedicine and telehealth, and the need for broadband, and a variety of other things that we didn't necessarily know would come in handy, but I believe from what I've seen, have come in handy, and have been the sort of things that make the state more resilient, not only to kind of the more traditional natural disasters, but also things like a pandemic. Um, and so, yeah, but basically, I then was able to kind of fill this joint role a little bit myself on the federal side there, and was able to consider a lot of not only the community elements, but also the economic elements. Um, and through that process, so I guess I'm kind of jointly covering that today in a way, but mainly I think the thing that I would like to just make be the kind of the most important thing I think I can share is just that we worked closely together with the state, and even with between federal partners, and that in that process and being able to do that, that really unique, helpful uh, ideas and things came out of that now as I have transitioned in my career, I'm still seeing from the economic side that things that I helped with support with the economic side of things and help them come up with, are happening, and things that they were able to provide to me that I um, hadn't necessarily considered in the past, and wouldn't have necessarily thought of or known, where I was able to take certain elements of things that they were coming up with on the economic side of things and bring those into our community side of things, and find ways to um, make that complementary and put that into the strategy. Because another thing that you'll notice if you're looking through the recovery support strategy yourself is that um, you'll see that we found cross-cutting issues, and we focused on that, and we spent a good chunk of time trying to think about not only just how are these, here's just kind of these main issues, and we just like put them into a box and say, well, that's a community issue, and that's an economic issue, and that's a health issue, and that's an agriculture issue, but um, or transportation and infrastructure, like those all are interconnected, and that's one of the things. And I think part of why FEMA is the designated coordinating agency for the community recovery support function, um, uh, because mostly because they also have that power to like do the full overall coordination on the federal side, and bring those other agencies in and things, because community ends up kind of being that real broad catch-all, but also is the goal of that is to take that down to different levels of government as well, and look closely at communities and their organizations and the different things. Whereas some to some extent, the other recovery support functions will mostly focus on a broader, more regional state level, not necessarily, and not so much in this case. And I think I appreciated that. That was a good thing. But the in general, that community element can tend to function as kind of the catch-all of like, well, this doesn't quite fit here exactly, but we have something we want to do about this, but this other group might have something that works in their area. How about we put it under house it under a community, but then identify that it affects this and this and this. So whatever this particular issue is affects the infrastructure, and we'll need input from that. But it'll also need some input from natural and cultural resources, and all that, but it's at a local government level, and it's going to need to work support from regional planning organizations and different things. So then we can kind of like put all that together, um, and uh, and and find a way to bring have that coordination and that deeper connection to addressing concerns that otherwise can kind of help think outside the box of where maybe a specific organization or agency in the federal government or at the state level wouldn't necessarily have taken on that concern or issue in normal times or in general, even without thinking through this process after a disaster, wouldn't have really thought that was something that applied to them. But then we find actually this applies to them. Like they and that's where we can go in and say, you know what, that's cool because I think that I don't want to get into too much details and sharing different things as far as like the specific project that I've kind of just been thinking of that ended up getting funded through EDA, but was like developed kind of in that coordination with FEMA and the state. But it's not what you would think of as a traditional economic development project. And it's not something that EDA probably would have normally looked at and thought, oh yeah, let's fund that. But because of the process of thinking through that and working with those local officials and thinking about how that impacts economic development and this sort of different kinds of things, but it's also infrastructure related and it's also general kind of more resilience related and everything else, was able to take it and say, well, because I mean, it's something that normally you would want FEMA to fund. But in this case, it didn't quite meet the specifications for FEMA. But that kind of goal there too is that FEMA can then, and what kind of I was in some ways tasked with, as well as more like the broader support of the group with FEMA that I was working with, is to try to find, well, okay, if FEMA can't fund this for whatever reason, can we find other federal agencies that might be able to fund it? And that's one of the big, just like the big good things that come out of that process. But that come out of that process best when we're actually working with the state and coordinating the way that we did in this case to be able to actually find those things and to know that there's a need and then to go and say, well, what could this, if we've identified that this is cross-cutting and it's into like this category and this category, then maybe the federal agency that works with this category would have some kind of resources or program that would address that. And then being able to find that fit to where you can still get the resources that are needed to the community, but maybe not from the traditional route that you would have thought would work. Um, and I think that that's, it could have happened organically, probably in some cases, but I really think that the process that we went through and the great work that we were able to get and support from the state um, and all of their partners, and then um, combining that with the federal side of things and the reach back that FEMA has to go back to all these other agencies and say, hey, we need you over here. You have funding for this, or you have expertise on this, and so come on, and like you have to do it because it's just statutorily required that like FEMA can make the other agencies come and get involved. Whereas sometimes they don't want to, but they always end up finding that it's useful, and we always can make it happen. So it's something I don't think states necessarily realize is that kind of resource that's there, or they just want it to happen, but don't want to necessarily take the time to coordinate and describe the issues and get on that level that needs to be drilled down to be able to really find the best assistance. And so I was just blown away at the great work that we were able to do in Missouri because of the dedication and the commitment and the coordination of the state and being willing to work with us and to follow a process, but also to lead the process because um, at the end of it, at the end of the day, like FEMA and all the other federal agencies are still there to support the state. And I think that something about the federal government sometimes can just seem, I don't know, big or scary, or like they're going to come in and be the overlords and tell you exactly what you have to do. But that may be the case sometimes, but it's not with disaster recovery and not with the way that FEMA intends to and usually does or would, if offered the opportunity, lead that. And then it's a constant go back to the state, go back to the ground level, and look from that bottom up level of like what are the greatest needs at the local um, level and what are the resources they need. What kind of input can we get from them um, to really lead this recovery from that side of things. And so, FEMA, I and some of my supporting colleagues. I mean, when we first came in, yeah, we did collect, and we always do, just like collect a ton of data and research to go through all the different media elements and try to do interviews and pull from all the different data sources that we can, census and state data and all sorts of stuff to try to get this broader picture of what was the like real impact and where are the communities that were impacted the most and all of that. And that's a whole other element that I hope is very useful to the state to have and then can continue on and be updated. And we call that the community conditions assessment. But and we do that, and we always offer that when we come in as a federal agency to support. FEMA does, but it's only as good as the input that it can get put into it. And what was just really good with this process that we worked through in Missouri was that we were able to get that data, present that, and share information with the state that they didn't necessarily know because they didn't necessarily hadn't gone and tried to crunch all those numbers or find all the data and pull all that up and put it all into one place. So that was good. They got to learn things from that. But then we got to learn things from them that we often don't because they also had their own sources of data and their own information that we could put into that and then build that into the strategies and share that in those community sessions, share that with the communities and say, hey, here's what this looks like in your community or the community next to you. And how is that impacting you? And then get that their actual on the ground level, like what does that look like? And how is that impacting real people rather than just some like statistics and saying, well, it looks like that things are really bad in this community and maybe not so bad in this community, but you can't really know that until you get that close level there of being able to actually talk with people and making it personalized and to the greatest extent that I think we could with the resources that we had and the time that we had and all of that. I think that we've really actually accomplished that with this process in Missouri and that it's ongoing and it's going to continue because I mean a lot of things that we found were that as much as Missouri had made some great steps to prepare and to start putting structures in place, there's a long way to go because there always is. And I was just amazed with how far Missouri had already come. But also, there's always also a long way to go, a big road. And fortunately, I think that we developed a good roadmap for how to get down that road. And hopefully the next time, because there will always be another disaster, even though we wish there wouldn't be, but there will be more floods. Maybe not right away, but sometime. And there will be other things, tornadoes, and who knows what the future holds. We just had COVID that we totally didn't expect necessarily. So, and we're still ongoing with that. So, just being able to have those resources in place and having thought about it and where can we go and how to, and just building those connections in the community with that. And of course, I mean, I'm in a different position now, but that Jessica, the state disaster recovery coordinator, was able to just reach out to me to have me come and talk about the experience here. That those connections and those relationships exist that wouldn't necessarily have otherwise, and that there's that reach back continues, and that even if it's not necessarily the same people in all the same positions and everything else, that the federal support is ideally still there, and that the state has those resources to go back to, and that's the other thing too with that being with the recovery support strategy. I guess I'll kind of end on this. The importance of this is maybe not as obvious when you see that first page of the recovery support strategy, and it's not the best scan, it's a little blurry, but like it has two signatures on there that are very important that are not always on there. And being able to see that the signatures from the primary state official and the primary federal official is a joint kind of resolution of sorts, but a commitment from both the federal agencies and the state agencies to continue to work together to do those specific strategies to the extent that's possible, and to continue to try to coordinate on that and bring that into the future, and keep having that going so that this was one of the times where some of that work had begun, but also there was a lot of new stuff to figure out and new people and new connections to make. And some of those connections will last better than others, and there's can be things too, like where I've moved to a different position, but I may also get sent out at some point if there's something in the future with now on behalf of the Economic Development Administration, and I have that connection now. If I show up, I know Missouri, and I know to some extent, I lived there throughout the time, and it was only about 5 or 6 months, but you get a feel for that, and met these amazing people, and still have those connections. So and so I think that being able to, whether it's the exact same people or not necessarily, there that information was retained and it exists, and it exists in those agencies and in the federal and in state level, and can be brought back up and improved upon each time, so that each time there's another disaster, hopefully there's a better chance to make a better recovery, make a build back stronger, and just make Missouri even better than it already is each time, that people don't get put down, even if it's a little bit of a step back when there's interruption of things and normal and the disasters, that new normal will always be ultimately a better normal, and just be able to keep growing and working towards better things and better days ahead, no matter and what crazy things end up having to be faced, that the state will be more and more ready to face those, and that the connections that are needed to bring in the right resources and people to respond to those incidents are there and are strong and are consistent, and keep moving things forward. So that's what I was wanting to share, and I'd like to thank Jessica for giving me the opportunity and for hosting this thing, and just for everyone that listened to me ramble on here for a while, if there's still anyone listening, but I appreciate it, and hope to get back to Missouri in the near future. Hopefully not for a disaster purpose, but one way or the other. Look forward to getting back there, and definitely enjoyed my time there, and learned a lot, and I'm excited to keep that going and support as best I can, also from the Denver region of the Economic Development Administration, which is Missouri is included in. Don't ask me why, but that's how it works. So I'm in Denver, Colorado now, but yeah, I'm happy to answer questions or support people anytime I can. So yeah, you can always email me at no longer the email everyone probably had, that was my FEMA one, but the A Cutler, Cutler, ACUTLER at eda.gov. So thanks.